You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 300 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. For this milestone episode of the show, I'm bringing on a very special guest, Peter Van Buren. He's a former State Department official and the author of several books, including We Meant Well, which is a story of his time in Iraq as a State Department official working on nation building, and Hooper's War, where Peter talks about the perils of occupation and moral injury. All of his work can be found on his website, We Met Well. He's been published at several different places, including Reuters and The American Conservative and antiwar.com. This show can be found at libertarianinstitute.org there on the homepage, along with my other work, including my daily news roundup, which is featured there as well. And support for this show can be given at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. So, Peter, on the show in the past, I've talked a little bit about your book, Hooper's War, and just how much I like how, it's a story about World War II Japan, but I think it, from more of like what you get out of it intellectually, it's really a story about occupation. And you really focus on this product of occupation called moral injury. And so I think it's a concept that a lot of people haven't heard of, and even the more enlightened of us even only think of the PTSD as being an issue. But do you want to explain a little bit moral injury and how it differs or would present differently than a PTSD?
Absolutely. And thank you for saying some nice things about the book. Like a lot of fiction, which is what Hooper's War is, you try to use one event to comment on another event that's probably too delicate to hit head on. And so trying to talk about the things that happen during war and an occupation, when I really want to talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, it's easier to do that if we set it in World War II. That pulls the politics a little further into the background and allows us, the individual politics, and allows us to focus on the larger issues. And that's what I've done in Hooper's War. You're absolutely correct. The book is only tangentially about Japan and World War II. It's about the issues that face us as an imperial power, as an empire, and individual soldiers. And one of those is the concept of moral injury. This is something that's only beginning to make inroads into civilian psychological vocabulary, but it is fairly well known among military psychologists. And it centers on the idea that if we can be damaged physically by war, by the things we see, by the things we do, by the things we don't do, then as moral thinking human beings, we can be damaged morally as well. And so in this idea, PTSD focuses more on the physical. In other words, in a wartime situation, when you hear big loud noises, you learn to instantly get underneath something or behind something. Big loud noises often mean someone is shooting at you, or a bomb has gone off, or something dangerous is about to happen. And you train yourself instinctively to react to it. In this case, physically, your heart rate speeds up, you dive behind a tree, those kind of things. Obviously, when you come back to New York City, this skill is not as useful because loud noises that aren't deadly to you happen all the time. And moral injury takes that another step and says that if our bodies can be trained to inappropriately react physically to the things that happen in war, the same thing can happen morally. And an easy example would be someone who participates in the killing of a child and can't come back into a normal society and interact with children because he knows he's done something terribly, terribly morally wrong. And this has scarred him at, we'll call it a soul, just for lack of a better term. But we can also use the word core center, whatever word you want to use that you're comfortable with. I don't want to bring religion into it because this isn't, though it overlaps with religion. Moral injury is not a religious term. It describes what happens to men and women who are exposed to morally injurious acts in wartime.
Yeah, and there's a great interview on the Sky Horton Show pretty recently with Matthew Ho and Danny Surgeon,
Yes.
where they both talk about some of their experiences from the war. And I know, like, especially Matthew mainly focuses on the kind of the PTSD, and I know he's dealing with some TBI right now.
Mm-hmm.
So on, like, kind of the physical changes that occur to the brain because of these traumatic events. But they also talk about a little bit the moral injury. And I think at one point, it's Matthew Ho who describes himself when he's talking about his relationship with his wife as being a completely different person post-war than pre-war. And so I just think that's why this topic is absolutely so important, is because we're talking about, young men here, mostly, and women, but, people in their 20s who come back a completely different person because of these injuries.
I don't know Danny, but I'm very proud to call Matt a friend, and he and I have spoken extensively. And though all of the characters in Hooper's War are fictional, and many of them are composite fictional, in other words, events that happen to a range of people end up in the character of, for example, the main character, Nate Hooper. He doesn't represent any one person. Matt's experiences in war are very much a part of the makeup of those characters, and Matt's experiences with moral injury were very much a part of my own education on the topic and very much informed Hooper's War. If we are moral people, if we as human beings understand that there are right and wrong in the world, then we simply can't say that committing wrongs won't have some type of effect on us. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, this concept of moral injury has gotten a lot of attention and traction inside military psychological circles, because the psychiatrists there have struggled to understand what it is that happens to people like Matt Ho in war. And we've come so far with it. We've always known. I mean, anybody who had to read Red Badge of Courage in high school, or has seen Saving Private Ryan, or any Vietnam War movie, knows that we've known about this problem for a long time. We gave it different names. It was called shell shock or PTSD or helicopter syndrome or whatever. But we've known it exists for hundreds of years, if not longer. And we've struggled to find a way to understand it and explain it. And now we're starting to develop a much more sophisticated understanding. We've gone from simply saying everything from alcohol addiction to shaky hands as some kind of PTSD, to understanding there's a moral component and a physical component, that individuals who had their heads literally rattled by explosions suffer physical damages to their brain. That's what traumatic brain injury, TBI, is. And that this can cause personality and psychology. So it's a positive thing that we're beginning to understand that what happens to the people we send off to war in our name affects them far beyond physically. And while as a nation we correctly pay tribute to those who come back missing an arm or a leg, we need to understand that there's a lot of damaged people walking around who look like they've got all the right parts in place, but in fact carry something with them that we can't see. And Hooper's War is an attempt to bring this concept of moral injury to a broader audience.
Something that I've started paying attention to more recently is that there's a lot of these vets from the Middle East, the terror wars, that have been discharged other than honorably. And so this definitely limits their access to, different services once they get out. And I saw recently that I guess Yale is kind of backing a group of about 50,000 of these guys in a class action lawsuit, saying that, that their other than honorable discharges were, due to behavior that resulted from their service. And, not all of this is the PTSD, But, this is just, I want to stress, so important. And, a lot of these people are fairly young, but have significant, disabilities moving forward.
Absolutely. And I don't know the exact status of it, but there are things before Congress that are looking to expand health care coverage to veterans who were discharged other than honorably. So just for the listeners who may not be familiar with it, the idea is if you do a good job in the military and you don't get caught committing crimes and all that, you're discharged honorably. And as a honorable veteran, you're entitled to a range of services, including certain kinds of medical care. Let's take an easy one. You stole stuff, not related to any war or injury or anything. You just wanted something for free and you stole it. And you can be discharged less than honorably. There's a series of degradations, serious, less serious, depending on how much you stole. And one of the penalties for being discharged other than honorably is being denied access to some of these benefits, including some of the health care. The problem comes is when you get people who were discharged less than honorably that leave the military with things like PSD or moral injury or traumatic brain injury. Denying them health care is essentially signing their suicide note for them. They may have been kicked out because they got into a fight in the barracks, but the problem is if that fight was motivated by PTSD and they're denied health care for PTSD, that's what contributes to the terrifyingly high rate of veteran suicide. And as I said, there are moves underway, but I don't know the exact status of them now to try to correct some of that. But as you can imagine, it's quite a complicated situation.
So something that I don't know anything about, and I just wanted to ask you, as you are a kind of State Department veteran, do you see any kind of this for the State Department officials that have been kind of deployed in these nation building wars? And it's just, I don't know. It's nothing that I've never seen anything about it. So I just
absolutely. In fact, I'm very familiar with a case that appears in my mirror every morning. A lot of what I've written about in Hooper's War, the descriptions of depression and thoughts of harming oneself and the issues in there with alcohol dependency, very reluctantly, I have to tell you, came from my own life and my own experience. And I'm not alone in that in the State Department, simply because we didn't carry a gun, but were otherwise exposed to the same things in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, doesn't relieve us of these dangers of things like moral injury. One component of moral injury, for example, does not involve guns at all. It involves failure to stop something. In other words, the traditional thoughts on moral injury and PTSD, the kind of textbook example, involves a soldier who accidentally shoots a child, for example. That one's pretty straightforward. But another form of moral injury comes from not stopping something that you might have been able to stop that harmed other people. Whether that was another soldier who took up a weapon against a civilian, or maybe a government program that was simply dollars and cents and signing papers that ended up injuring thousands of people, if not more. That can contribute to moral injury as well. And so it is not limited to people in uniform or people who carry weapons. It is very much a part of many people's State Department experience in those war zones. The difference is that the general public could care less about the State Department. And second, the State Department is a smaller group. The number of people affected is much, much smaller than the military. And the State Department has kind of a different internal tradition of not talking about its problems, coupled with the ability of most people in the State Department to seek out private psychological care, whereas if you're in the military and you're deployed to the middle of a desert, that option is a lot harder to get to. So there's some factors, good and bad, that keeps this out of the public eye in regards to the State Department, but don't think for a minute it doesn't affect us.
All right, well, this is kind of the direction I have wanted to take the show next, is just to talk about your other book and your experiences in the Middle East. which is We Meant Well. And I think this is specifically written about your time in the Iraq and our nation building efforts there.
Yeah.
I think this conversation is important to have right now because, if we see the actual drawdown of troops in the Middle East, one of the things that the war hawks are going to cry is that this is bad for the people of these countries because they need the United States and our freedom to rebuild their nation. And so, Peter, maybe you could give us just like the short thing that you would say to somebody to kind of tell them that I have the experience and that's absolutely not true.
Been there, done that, and written the book. In 2009, the State Department sent me to Iraq to lead 2 reconstruction teams with the goal of making Iraq a better place. We were going to build schools and roads and irrigation ditches and vaccinate children, do all the good things, and make Iraq a better place. And along the way, hopefully create a democracy and all that good stuff. I was going to win the war for us. And what I found was that the whole episode was a fraud. We were mostly involved in wasting money, either directly or as a way of feeding money to piratous contractors who only wanted to pocket cash and could care less about Iraq. We had no plan. We had no coordination. We didn't know how to work with the local population. We made every mistake we possibly could, and I wrote them all down in the book. The subtitle of the book is How I Helped Lose the War. And I figured no one else was taking responsibility for losing the war in Iraq, so I might as well be the one who did that. So I saw it. And when the book came out in 2011, it was quite controversial because the Obama administration, as the Bush administration before him, was telling the American public that we had won. We've done everything right. This is exactly how this is all going to go, and we're going to follow this example in Afghanistan and Yemen and Libya and Syria and all these others. And I knew it was a lie. And not many people were willing to believe me when I told them it was a lie and backed it up with written documents and information. I tried to contact over 100 members of Congress to meet with me, and only one was willing to do that, and that was Dr. Paul. And other than that, no one wanted to hear it. I got to talk to a couple of low-level congressional staffers for the Foreign Relations Committee who basically dismissed me and said, look, everything you're saying is contradicted by the State Department and the Department of Defense and the White House, and why should we believe you? The door is over there on your left. And that experience, of course, now is kind of funny, not in a hilarious way, but in a funny way, because it's currently understood that we failed in Iraq. I think that's fair. That's pretty much common knowledge that this whole thing was a disaster and a failure, at least among thinking people. And the idea that I was disbelieved so vigorously remains a bitter spot for me. And circling back to the idea of moral injury, certainly has not helped me in dealing psychologically with the things that happened in Iraq. I also should point out that writing that book got me thrown out of the State Department. I had 24-year career. I like to characterize it as remarkably mediocre career. I wasn't a troublemaker and I wasn't a high flyer. I just kind of mumbled along. But after the book came out, I was still an active employee. After the book came out, the State Department tried to prosecute me on trumped up claims that it was classified. Then they tried to fire me for insubordination and national security violations. And eventually the whole thing had to be negotiated down with my forced very early retirement. It was a hell of a price to pay for simply telling the truth. But as the naivety was swept away from me, I came to understand that telling the truth is one of the most expensive things you can do.
Well, I do really appreciate you telling the truth because I've personally learned a whole lot from what you said. You have a great archive, by the way, on the Scott Horton Show. If people don't listen to Peter Van Buren on the Scott Horton Show, you really should. There's some great interviews there on topics ranging from, the Middle East to North Korea and some of your insights on the situation there. I did want to ask if there was a particular program that you would point out that you were involved in Iraq that was just either the worst or like the best example of why this fails.
Well, I could say all of them, or I could say, please read the book. But to be generous, one that stands out was the veterinary vaccination program. We were in an area that was largely rural and was farmers, and so it was decided in Washington that we should start vaccinating the animals against diseases so that they'll have healthier cows and stuff like this. And when word got around that we were purchasing vaccinations in bulk, we drove the price of vaccinations up hundreds of percent, to the point where no one could afford to buy them but us. Now, not only were we wasting an awful lot of money, but when Washington changed its mind a month or so later and said, well, we're not doing vaccinations anymore, we're moving on to election stuff, so stop paying for vaccinations. When we stopped, the guys who were selling these things never kind of got the memo that we were done and kept the prices so high that for most of a year after we discontinued the program, no one could afford to vaccinate their animals. And animals died all over the place because of our ignorant goodwill. And so a program that on the face seemed like a no-brainer actually ended up doing significant harm, driving some farmers into poverty and bankruptcy, causing people to get sick because they were drinking contaminated milk because the cows were sick. And it caused everyone to hate the United States and opened the door for militias and terrorists or whatever you want to call the bad guys, to make inroads into the local population. So that's a good, concise example, but there are literally hundreds of those kinds of stories that I documented in the book, and happened every day in Iraq, in front of us, and we've made the same mistakes over and over again.
Well, yeah, and we're either rebuilding Iraq again or trying to rebuild it still now that ISIS is gone, and so these conversations are going to come up. So definitely check out Peter's book. We Meant Well. If you're going to recommend a book to someone, if I had, either Scott Horton's book, Fool's Errand, or your book, Cooper's War, I think Cooper's War is the one I would give to a layperson, just because, Scott's book makes the definitive case against the Afghan war, but at the same time, they're probably never going to get past the first chapter. And Cooper's War is so easy to read, and, it's a good story too. It's a well-written book, Peter, and that's so important. It's not just a, anti-war message.
The way we like to describe it is a good story with a conscience, because Scott wrote a definitive book on Afghanistan, and it's a brilliant piece of work. I wrote a story. I wrote a book that you can sit down and read on a plane or on a weekend when you've got a couple of hours. It's got adventure. It's got stories in it. It's some hopefully interesting characters doing interesting things. But there's a conscience to it. There's a point to it. And hopefully you walk away from Hooper's War with a larger sense of the cost of war, on a very individual level. And if that persuades one person to stand up the next time America wants to go to war and say, let's think this through, then I've done my job.
Well, Peter, is there any way people could support you financially or otherwise, other than by buying your butts?
Well, they can come over and do the dishes. I have got a ton of dishes in the sink. Other than that, the best thing to do would be please consider buying one of my books. I'm on Amazon, and the books are available there. And if someone was kind enough to purchase a copy, that helps me continue my work directly. If you've got a copy or you don't want to read it yourself, and you want to donate one to your local library so that they've got something a little more subversive than Max Boot's latest example of why we need to go to war with Iran, that's a good thing as well. I don't do GoFundMe or anything along those lines. I prefer to give people value for their money. So my blog, my website is free, wemeantwell.com. My articles appear on antiwar.com at no cost to them. And the books are the way that if someone wanted to support me and continue to hear my voice, the best way to do it. And I appreciate all the support and the chance to appear on podcasts like this.
All right. And the last thing I just want to mention real quick is Peter's also on Facebook under his name, Peter Van Buren. I know most people followed you on Twitter, and I loved your Twitter account. And I thought the joke that got you kicked off of Twitter was absolutely hilarious. I know you've kind of walked it back, but I think it's funny. So, but anyways, you're now on Facebook. I just realized you have a Facebook page and you post there pretty often.
Yes.
And it's the same kind of content analysis that you're putting out on Twitter. So if you liked them on Twitter, go check them out on Facebook.
Please do that. I got kicked off of Twitter for telling a bunch of journalists that they were full of garbage and that as a government official, I lied to them all the time and they bought it every time and no one ever bothered to ask any questions. And this upset the powers that be. And eventually I made a bad zombie joke. I was watching The Walking Dead while I was doing Twitter and I said to one journalist, I hope a magma, Make America Great Again guy eats your face or something like that. And, this clearly violated Twitter's nonviolence policies because clearly I intended for zombies to walk the earth, stalk this guy down. And for that, I received a lifetime ban from Twitter. So there you go.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show, Peter.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much. Take care, please.
All right, Peter, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me, and I think my audience will get a lot out of it. For those of you who could take the time to share this show, it could be found at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and at the Libertarian Institute, where my daily news roundup could be found as well. You could donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Twitter is at KYAAALE. Don't forget to check out my news website, immersionnews.com. And then that's also the name of my Minds account, which is a new crypto-based social networking site. And so if you're on that, subscribe to the Immersion News channel. Let me know who you are, and I'll subscribe back to you and make sure you're getting access to my content there.